Let's go to Mr. Land, the land of magic. Come on and see. Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 8, Mr. Messy.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name, messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, there were tiles missing from the roof, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds, the garden hedge was off its hinges, and had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, stretched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top of the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's messy house with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage that he had ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden, clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning! I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking him up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, appearing out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. "We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," added Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But, I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and, bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the wood. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat, when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I have ever seen in all my born days," they both said together at the same time. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed, and mowed, and proned, and snipped, and clipped, and cleaned, and dug, and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned, and primed, and rubbed, and painted, and mended, and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than he had ever looked before. "There we are," said Mr. Tidy. "All finished," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. "Precisely," replied Mr. Tidy. "What we're both thinking," they said together to Mr. Messy, "is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this." But, said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. "You know what I'm going to have to do now," he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. "What are you going to have to do?" they asked Mr. Messy. "I'm going to have to change my name," said Mr. Messy. And then he chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. And then Mr. Messy laughed. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed. And then they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story. Except to say that if you're a messy sort of a person, you might have a visit from two people. And you know what they are called, don't you?
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 9, Mr. Topsy-Turvy.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Topsy-Turvy was a funny sort of a fellow. Everything about him was either upside down or inside out, or back to front. Topsy-turvy, in fact. It was all very extraordinary. To give you some idea of how topsy-turvy Mr. Topsy-Turvy was, you ought to see his house. The front door is upside down to start with, and the curtains hung upside down to the windows. And just look at that chimney pot. All very extraordinary. Inside is the same. Just look at the clock standing on Mr. Topsy-Turvy's mantelpiece. Isn't that the topsiest-turviest clock you've ever seen? And just look at the way Mr. Topsy-Turvy reads a book. Not only does he read it upside down, but he starts to read it at the back page. And just look where Mr. Topsy-Turvy puts the stamp when he sends a letter to somebody. Have you ever seen anything like it? Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Topsy-Turvy came to the town where you and I live. Nobody is quite sure how Mr. Topsy-Turvy got there or where he came from, but he did arrive because somebody saw him getting off the train. Trouble was, he did it in a topsy-turvy way and got out of the wrong side and fell onto the railway line, which really isn't all that surprising, is it? When he'd picked himself up and managed to find his way out of the station, Mr. Topsy-Turvy went to a hotel to find a room to spend the night. The hotel manager tried not to smile when he saw Mr. Topsy-Turvy walk into his hotel, carrying his suitcase upside down, and with his topsy-turvy hat on his head. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "Can I help you?" Now, something you didn't know about Mr. Topsy-Turvy is the way he speaks. You see, he sometimes gets things the wrong way round. "Afternoon good," said Mr. Topsy-Turvy to the hotel manager. "I'd room I like." The manager scratched his head. "You mean you'd like a room?" he asked. "Please, yes," replied Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Eventually, the hotel manager managed to work out what Mr. Topsy-Turvy was talking about, and he was taken up in the lift to a bedroom. Then, Mr. Topsy-Turvy unpacked his suitcase, put on his pajamas, and went to bed. He was rather tired after travelling from wherever he'd come from. The following day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy went round the town, but what a fuss his going round the town caused. He took a taxi from the hotel, but so confused the taxi driver trying to tell him where he wanted to go, the poor man drove straight into a traffic light. "Oh dear," said Mr. Topsy-Turvy. "I am sorry very." Then he went into a big department store in the middle of the town. He walked up to one of the counters. "I'd like a sock of pears," he said to the lady behind the counter. "You mean a pair of socks?" she smiled, and showed him a pair of bright red socks. Mr. Topsy-Turvy put them on his hands. Then he tried to leave, but being Mr. Topsy-Turvy, he tried to walk down the up escalator, and the people who were going up the up escalator all fell over themselves. It was a terrible topsy-turvy jumble. That day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy did all sorts of topsy-turvy things. He walked backwards across the street walking and caused an enormous traffic jam. He went to a library and put all the books upside down on the shelves and made everybody extremely cross. Then he went to an art gallery and insisted on hanging all the pictures upside down so that he could look at them properly. And then, after Mr. Topsy-Turvy had been in the town for just one day, he disappeared. Nobody knew how he went or where he went, but he certainly went because he wasn't there anymore. The whole town breathed a sigh of relief. But what the town discovered, even though Mr. Topsy-Turvy had left, was that everything was still topsy-turvy. "Read all it about!" shouted the newspaper sellers, instead of shouting, "Read all about it!" "News is the here," said the television newsreader, instead of saying, "Here is the news." "Morning, good," people started saying to each other when they met, and "Do you how?" instead of "How do you do?" Everybody was talking topsy-turvy. Can you think of something to say that's topsy-turvy? Go on, try.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 10, Mr. Silly.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as can be. In Nonsense Land, the trees are pink, and the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And did you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, they don't fly forwards. They fly backwards. It really is a very silly place indeed. Which of course is why Mr. Silly lives there. Mr. Silly, in fact, lives in quite the silliest looking house you have ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier looking house than that? Now, this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land each year, they hold a competition, and the cup is awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly has never won the cup, but each night, lying in his bed, he dreamed about winning it. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realized that he would have to think up something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you might be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee, which he put a spoonful of marmalade into. After that, he had a cornflake sandwich, and to finish, he had a boiled egg. But being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell as well. Isn't that a silly breakfast? Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking how to win that cup. He remembered 2 years ago the cup was won by Mr. Ridiculous. He won by wallpapering his house, which sounds very ordinary, but in fact, Mr. Ridiculous had wallpapered the outside of his house. And Mr. Silly remembered last year when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish, who was a friend of Mr. Silly's, had won the cup by inventing a car. It was quite a normal car, apart from one thing. It had square wheels. Isn't that silly? Mr. Silly fought and fought and fought, but it was no good. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade, but that didn't help either. So, he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open so that he wouldn't have burglars when he was out. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing Wellington boots and carrying an umbrella. "Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear Wellington boots and carry an umbrella?" he said to the chicken. "Meow," said the chicken, because animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises as they do in your country. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a worm wearing a top hat, a monocle, and an old school tie. "Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear a top hat, a monocle, and an old school tie?" he said to the worm. "Quack, quack," said the worm. Next, Mr. Silly met a pig wearing trousers and a bowler hat. "Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear trousers and a bowler hat?" he said to the pig. "Meow," said the pig. Isn't that silly? It was in the middle of Mr. Silly's walk that he had his idea. It was a beautifully silly idea. Quite the silliest idea he ever had. He hurried into town and bought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. The day of the great awarding of the Nonsense Cup arrived. A huge crowd assembled in the city square to see who was going to win the cup. The king of Nonsense Land mounted the specially built platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the crowd in the city square, "it is my pleasure today to award the Nonsense Cup to whoever has had the silliest idea of the year." "One of the silliest ideas of the year," continued the king, "is by Mr. Muddle, the farmer. He has managed to grow, of all things, a square apple." The crowd clapped as the square apple was held up by Mr. Muddle for everybody to see. He felt sure he was going to win. "However," said the king, and Mr. Muddle's face fell, "we have had an even sillier idea entered by Mrs. Nincompoop." It was a teapot, quite the silliest teapot there ever had been. The crowd broke into thunderous applause. "I therefore have great pleasure," announced the king, "in presenting the Nonsense Cup to—" Just then he looked up and stopped in astonishment. Now, in the middle of the city square, there's a tree. It's always been there, and it was at this tree that the king was looking in astonishment. "What," he cried, "has happened to that tree?" Everybody turned to look. The tree had green leaves, bright green leaves. Not pink leaves like all the trees in Nonsense Land, but green. There was an amazed silence. "It was me," piped up Mr. Silly. "I painted all the leaves green last night when you were all asleep." "A green tree!" exclaimed the king. "Who ever heard of a green tree?" "A green tree!" shouted the crowd. "How silly!" And they started to applaud. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hand. "I think," he said, "that this is the silliest idea I have ever heard of, and therefore I award the Nonsense Cup to Mr. Silly." The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. And a bird, perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree, looked down. "Woof!" it said, and flew off, backwards.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 11, Mr. Uppity.
It really is a pantomime.
This is the story of Mr. Uppity, and how Mr. Uppity finishes the story, not quite so uppity as at the beginning of the story. You see, Mr. Uppity was one of the rudest people in the world, if not the rudest. He was rude to anybody and everybody. So, of course, in Big Town, which is where he lived, he had no friends at all. Not one. "Miserable Uppity," they used to call him, and he certainly looked it. Now, as well as being rude, Mr. Uppity was also rich. Very rich. one of the richest people in the world, if not the richest. He had the largest, longest limousine in Big Town. He had the largest, longest garden in Big Town. He had, on top of the hill of the middle of Big Town, the most enormous house. The biggest house in Big Town. And there he lived, all alone. Miserable old Uppity. One day, Mr. Uppity was walking in the gardens of his enormous house when suddenly he heard a voice. A little voice.
Hello,
said the voice. Mr. Uppity looked, and there, in one of his hundreds of flower beds, was a goblin.
aren't you going to say hello to me?
Asked the goblin. Go away, said Mr. Uppity rudely.
Oh, I know who you must be.
Said the goblin.
You must be Mr. Uppity, who's rude to everybody.
Sniffed Mr. Uppity rudely.
Well, I know someone who wants to meet you.
Said the goblin, and skipped off the way goblins do.
Come on.
He called over his shoulder. Mr. Uppity's curiosity got the better of him. He followed.
In there.
Said the goblin, pointing at a small hole in a tree. Don't be silly, snorted Mr. Uppity.
Oh, I'm not being silly.
Said the goblin. Yes, you are, snapped Mr. Uppity. I can't possibly get in there.
Aha!
Smiled the goblin, and then he said a magic word known only to goblins, which sounded like wobbly gobbly gook, or something like that. Suddenly, Mr. Uppity started shrinking. He shrank and he shrank until he was exactly the same size as the goblin.
Turn me back to my proper size at once.
Spluttered Mr. Uppity in a rage.
Shan't.
Grinned the goblin. And so saying, the goblin climbed through the hole into the tree. Poor Mr. Uppity didn't know what to do, so he followed him. Inside the tree, there was a staircase going down and down. Do you know where it led to? It led directly to the kingdom of the goblins. That's where.
I demand to be taken immediately to whoever's in charge,
said Mr. Uppity angrily.
Oh, you shall. You shall.
Grinned the goblin, and he led Mr. Uppity through the streets of the kingdom of the goblins until they came to a palace.
What? Who goes there?
Cried the goblin sentry at the gate.
I have brought Mr. Uppity.
Said the goblin.
Oh.
Said the sentry, and smiled. The goblin and Mr. Uppity passed through the gates, and into a courtyard, and through some more gates, and along a long corridor, and through some large gold doors, and into a huge room. There, sitting on a gold throne, was the king of the goblins.
Your Majesty,
announced the goblin, bowing low.
may I present Mr. Uppity? Ah,
said the king.
So you're the fellow who goes about being rude to everybody and doesn't have any friends.
Nonsense, said Mr. Uppity rudely.
I can see that what I've heard is true.
Said the king, looking at the indignant Mr. Uppity.
You're much too puffed up with your own importance. Therefore,
he continued,
I am going to allow you to be turned back to your proper size. But when you get back to Big Town, if you're rude to anybody at all, you will immediately shrink to the size you are now. Do you understand?
The goblin then took Mr. Uppity back through the kingdom of the goblins, and up the staircase, and out of the tree at the bottom of Mr. Uppity's gardens. The goblin looked at Mr. Uppity, and said something which sounded like googly woogly blop, or something which is probably googly woogly walk, just said backwards. And Mr. Uppity grew and grew back to his original size.
Now, you remember what the king said.
Warned the goblin.
Don't be so uppity in future.
Mr. Uppity marched off furiously up to his enormous house. The following day, Mr. Uppity was out walking through the streets of Big Town. Suddenly, he came across a little boy playing with a ball. Get out of my way, snapped Mr. Uppity rudely. But as soon as he said it, you know what happened, don't you? Yes, Mr. Uppity shrank and shrank until he was no bigger than the ball the boy was playing with.
Oh dear.
He gasped, and then he thought.
I'm sorry.
He said to the boy.
What I meant to say was, please can I get past?
Immediately, Mr. Uppity grew to his original size, and the boy moved, and Mr. Uppity went on his way. Then he met an old lady carrying a large shopping basket. She was late for market. "Excuse me," she said to Mr. Uppity. "Could you tell me the time, please?" "No," said Mr. Uppity rudely. But as soon as he said it, you know what happened, don't you? Yes, Mr. Uppity shrank and shrank until he could easily have fitted into the old lady's basket.
Oh dear,
He gasped, and then he thought.
I'm sorry.
He said to the old lady.
What I meant to say was, it's 11:25.
Immediately, Mr. Uppity grew to his original size, and the old lady thanked him, and Mr. Uppity went on his way. Then he went and bought a newspaper from a man standing on the corner of the main street of Big Town. He was just about to walk away when suddenly he stopped and thought. He turned back to the man and said, "Thank you." Thank you were two words Mr. Uppity had never used before. The man smiled. A smile was something Mr. Uppity wasn't used to getting. Then Mr. Uppity was stopped by a man who asked him if he could tell him the way to the bank. Mr. Uppity was about to say no when he thought. "Yes," he said, and told the man. "Thank you," said the man. Thank you were words Mr. Uppity not only had never used before, but had never had said to him before. Mr. Uppity smiled. He felt happy. Happy was a feeling Mr. Uppity wasn't used to feeling. He liked it. And you know, from that day forward to this day backward, Mr. Uppity is a changed person. He's still the richest person in Big Town, perhaps the richest person in the world. But now he has lots of friends. And he smiles a lot. And he never gets that shrinking feeling. And do you know which words Mr. Uppity uses most of all these days? Please and thank you. So what we like to say is, thank you for reading the story. And if you're ever thinking about being rude to somebody, please keep a sharp lookout for goblins.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 12, Mr. Small.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Small was very small, probably the smallest person you've ever seen in your whole life, or perhaps the smallest person you've never seen in your whole life, because he was so small you probably wouldn't have seen him anyway. Mr. Small was about as big as a pin, which isn't very big at all, so perhaps we should say that Mr. Small was as small as a pin. Mr. Small lived in a small house underneath a daisy at the bottom of Mr. Robinson's garden. It was a very nice house, although very tiny, and it suited Mr. Small very well indeed. He liked living there. Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Small decided to get a job. The trouble was, what sort of job could Mr. Small do? After all, there aren't that many small jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, but hadn't had any ideas. Not one. He was thinking about it now while he was having lunch. He was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and a drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought and thought while he was eating his big lunch, but it was no use. Thinking just made him thirsty, so he had another drop of lemonade. "I know," he thought to himself. "After lunch, I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask his advice." So after lunch, he left his house and walked to Mr. Robinson's house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for somebody as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there, he stopped for a rest. He sat on a pebble, feeling quite out of breath. A worm crawled by and stopped. "Good afternoon, Mr. Small," said the worm. "Good afternoon, Walter," said Mr. Small to the worm, whom he knew quite well. "Up for a walk, are you?" asked Walter. "Going to see Mr. Robinson," replied Mr. Small. "Oh?" said Walter. "About a job," added Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter the worm again, and crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. After he rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again, and walked all the rest of the way to Mr. Robinson's house without stopping once. When he got there, he climbed up the steps to Mr. Robinson's door. He knocked at the door. Nobody heard him. He knocked again at the door. Nobody heard him. The trouble was, you see, that if you're as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very loud knock. Mr. Small looked up. There, high above his head, was a doorbell. "How can I ring the bell when I can't reach it?" thought Mr. Small to himself. He started to climb the wall, brick by brick, to reach the bell. He had climbed up 4 bricks when he made the mistake of looking down. "Oh dear," he said, and fell. Bang! "Ouch," said Mr. Small, rubbing his head. Just then, Mr. Small heard footsteps. It was the postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice. The postman looked down. "Hello," he said to Mr. Small. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Small," said Mr. Small. "Will you ring the bell for me, please?" "Of course I will," replied the postman in answer to Mr. Small's question, and reaching out, he pressed the bell with his finger. "Thank you," said Mr. Small. "My pleasure," said the postman, and off he went. Mr. Small heard footsteps coming to the door. The door opened. Mr. Robinson opened the door and looked out. "That's funny," he said. "I'm sure I heard somebody ring the bell." He was about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. "Hello," said the voice. "Hello, Mr. Robinson." Mr. Robinson looked down and down. "Hello," he said. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to ask your advice," said Mr. Small to Mr. Robinson. "Well," said Mr. Robinson, "you better come in and have a talk." Mr. Small followed Mr. Robinson into the house and perched on the arm of Mr. Robinson's favourite chair. He told him how he couldn't think of a job that he could do. Mr. Robinson sipped a cup of tea and listened. "So you see," Mr. Small explained, "how difficult it is." "Yes, I can see that," said Mr. Robinson, "but leave it to me." Mr. Robinson knew a lot of people. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a restaurant and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, putting mustard in mustard pots. But Mr. Small kept falling into the pots and getting covered in mustard, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody that worked in a sweet shop and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving sweets. But Mr. Small kept falling into the sweet jars, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody that worked in a place where they made matches and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, packing matches into boxes. But Mr. Small kept getting shot in the boxes with the matches, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody that worked on a farm and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, sorting out the brown eggs from the white eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he left that job. "What are we going to do with you?" Mr. Robinson asked Mr. Small one evening. "Don't know," said Mr. Small in a small voice. "I've got one more idea," said Mr. Robinson. "I know somebody who writes children's books. Perhaps you could work for him." So, the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's books. "Can I work for you?" Mr. Small asked the man. "Yes, you can," replied the man. "Toss me that pencil and tell me all about the jobs you've been doing. Then I'll write a book about it. I'll call it Mr. Small," he added. "But children won't want to read a book all about me," explained Mr. Small. "Yes, they will," replied the man. "They'll like it very much." And you did, didn't you?
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 13, Mr. Daydream.
It really is a pantomime.
This is a story about Mr. Daydream. You know what he looks like, don't you? Because you've seen his picture on the front of this book. It's also a story about a little boy called Jack. And you don't know what he looks like, so here's a picture of him. Now, Jack was a very good little boy. He always ate up all his lunch. He always went to bed when he was told. He always said please and thank you. But Jack was a daydreamer. Whenever he was supposed to be thinking about something, he found himself thinking about something else. Daydreaming. One day, Jack was at school. He was sitting at his desk, listening to the teacher talking about history. It was a very warm day, and Jack was glad he was sitting at the back of the classroom, next to the open window. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw something outside the window on the grass in front of the school. Something blue. It was a small, cloud-shaped figure. Jack couldn't believe his eyes. The figure looked at Jack, looking at him, smiled, and waved. Jack looked at his teacher, who was still talking. Then he got up quietly, ever so quietly, and slipped out of the open window. He crossed the grass to the strange-looking cloud-shaped figure. "Hello," he said. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Daydream," said the figure. "What's your name?" "Jack," said Jack. "I'm going off on an adventure," said Mr. Daydream to Jack. "Would you like to come with me?" "Oh, yes, please," replied Jack. "Very well, then," said Mr. Daydream, and, putting 2 fingers in his mouth, he let out the loudest whistle Jack had ever heard in his whole life. A huge bird swooped down out of the sky and landed beside Jack and Mr. Daydream. "Come on," said Mr. Daydream to Jack, and climbed onto the bird's back. Jack climbed on too. It was a really enormous bird, and there was plenty of room for both of them. "Hold on," said Mr. Daydream. Jack held on tight. The huge bird flapped its huge wings, and suddenly they were high up in the air. They flew faster and faster over the countryside. They flew over fields and farms and towns and hills and trees and valleys until they were far, far away from Jack's school. It was very exciting. Mr. Daydream turned to Jack. "How'd you like to go to Africa?" he shouted. They were traveling so fast now, Jack just nodded his head and held on even tighter. And they flew across the sea. Suddenly, it seemed in no time at all, there below them was Africa. The bird landed in a jungle clearing. Jack and Mr. Daydream climbed off the bird's back. It was very hot. "Come on," said Mr. Daydream to Jack. "Let's go and explore." So off they set, pushing their way through the jungle. Suddenly, in the middle of the clearing, they saw an elephant. "Hello, Mr. Daydream," trumpeted the elephant down its trunk. "Would you like a lift?" "Yes, please," replied Mr. Daydream, and the elephant reached out his trunk, picked him up, and then put him on his back. Then he reached out his trunk again, picked up Jack, and put him on his back. It was very high. The elephant carried them through the jungle until they came to a river. Then he set them down on the ground, said goodbye, and went off back into the jungle. "How are we going to cross the river?" Jack asked Mr. Daydream. "Perhaps I can be of assistance," wheezed a particularly oily voice coming from the river. They looked, and there was a crocodile. "Use my back as a bridge," suggested the crocodile. It was very helpful. They were halfway across the river on the crocodile's back when the crocodile grinned a rather nasty grin. All teeth and no smile. Then, flicking his enormous tail and shooting Jack and Mr. Daydream up into the air, the crocodile opened his horribly large mouth and waited. It was very frightening. "Oh dear!" gasped Jack as he looked down at that enormous mouthful of teeth. "Oh dear! Oh help!" Mr. Daydream, upside down beside him, put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out that very large whistle of his. Suddenly, just as the crocodile's teeth was about to go snap, the big bird swooped down out of the sky. Mr. Daydream and Jack landed right on the bird's back. "Phew!" said Jack. "Bother!" said the crocodile. "Well, I promised you an adventure, didn't I?" grinned Mr. Daydream. "You certainly did," said Jack. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we'll go to Australia." And they did. Jack learned to throw a boomerang so that it always came back to him. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we'll go to the North Pole." And they did. And Mr. Daydream fell right up to his middle in a snowdrift. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we'll go to the Wild West." And they did. And Mr. Daydream found a huge 10-gallon cowboy hat. The trouble was, when he put it on, he couldn't say out. "Jack!" he called from underneath the hat. "Jack! Jack!" Suddenly, Jack realized that it wasn't Mr. Daydream saying his name. It was his teacher. And Jack wasn't in the Wild West. He was sitting at his school desk. "Jack," said the teacher again, "you've been daydreaming." It was true. He had. But do you know something? Daydreaming is more fun than history.